You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. 6 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Larry Beinhardt's on the line with us. He's been writing these and researching and coming up with this just brilliant stuff. Larry's the author of Wag the Dog, The Librarian, Fog Facts, Searching for Truth in the Land of Spin, all available at nationbooks.org and, of course, bookstores and fine locations all across the planet. His new novel is Salvation Boulevard. His website, Larry Beinhardt, BEINHART.com. Larry, welcome to the show.
Thom, what a great introduction. Thank you.
Well, I am just blown away by, first of all, the fact that you're about the only guy out here who's doing this homework, which is this is I don't mean this as a put down. It's not rocket science to figure this stuff out, but you figured it out, and it is. I mean, it was conventional wisdom in the 1950s. It was conventional wisdom in the 1960s. It was conventional wisdom in the early 1970s. And over the last 40 years, we have all forgotten. The headline of your article, Why You Should Be Screaming for Higher Taxes. Give us the elevator speech, Larry Beinhardt.
Okay. Yeah, and when we're talking about screaming for higher taxes, we're screaming for higher taxes on other people.
Yeah, on the rich, basically, and on corporations.
Basically at the top end. And there's a direct correlation between high tax rates and economic growth. When we've had our highest tax rates or when we have higher tax rates, we have a lot of economic growth. And the period of our greatest growth, of course, is World War II and the post-World War II years, when the top marginal tax rate varied between 88 and 92%, which is almost impossible to conceive of nowadays.
Right.
Okay? People were being taxed at 92% of their income above a certain point.
Yeah, what would be the equivalent of about $3.2 million in today's money. And,
yeah, something like that.
And the consequence of that was that, number one, I can't think of any, I can't remember any dynastic families that emerged during that time period. There were no multi-billionaires who suddenly, no John Rockefellers, no Andrew Carnegies, no Bill Gateses, no Phil Knights, no dynastic billionaires who emerged because, 92% tax after $3.2 million bucks, people became content with $3.2 million bucks, number one. Number two, you had plenty of money to pay the middle class good living wages to do the work that was actually creating that wealth. And number three, we did not have bubbles, we did not have crashes, and we had an economy that like the little engine that could, just nice and steady and strong, just moved right along for almost 40 years until Ronald Reagan came along with his wrecking ball.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good summary. Actually, there's also a direct correlation between large tax cuts and a sequence of boom, bubble, and crash. We've had basically 3 times we've had large tax cuts. One's in the early 1920s. Coming out of World War I, we had a tax rate of around 70%, and then they took it down to in the 20s.
Right.
And that launched the boom of the 20s and the crash of 29. And then we have the Reagan tax cuts, which brings us to the crash of 87. And the crashes are fairly similar in that they include lots of bank failures. The difference in the 87 one is that we had a bailout. We had a huge bailout. And then, of course, we have this crash with the Bush tax cuts.
Right.
And it's the exact same sequence. And I don't understand why nobody else is making a correlation. I mean,
would it be reasonable
really
to guess or to assume or even to assert, Larry Beinhardt, that the reason why when you have tax cuts on the very rich, you have bubble, boom, bust economies, is that there is a certain reasonable limit at which people can, it's like trying to drink out of a fire hose. I mean, there's a limit at how fast you can drink, how much water you can put into your body, that there's a limit to how much how much cash somebody can take and appropriately set aside for investment. And so what happens is when you have these huge tax cuts so that the rich get very, very rich very, very fast, they're looking for a fast rate of return, and they start stashing that money in everything from commodities to stocks and bonds, and all of that inflates the market for those things, which creates the bubble.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair description of it. It's excess liquidity. And also, when you have part of what happens when you have a low tax rate, there's an incentive to try to turn money around as fast as possible.
How is that associated with a low tax rate?
Well, if you're being taxed on profits, right, which essentially a high tax rate is, right? You're taxed on how much money you're earning. I mean, you're taking out.
Right.
Okay. So if that tax rate is low, then the quicker you can make your profit and then reinvest it and make another quick profit again, the more money you make.
Right. So a low tax rate encourages churn.
If at the moment that you take it out, suddenly somewhere between 50 and 90% of it disappears.
To taxes.
You go, wait a minute. Let me think twice before I take this money out.
Right.
Okay? Let's see if by keeping the money in here, we can build a bigger company.
Right.
Or so that on paper and in terms of your overall wealth, you are in fact growing wealthier, but you don't have the cash.
Yeah.
So there's a disincentive to take it out. Then what happens is, if there's an incentive to take it out and to turn it over quickly, you're looking for quick turnaround things. And then you go into places where you're gambling.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be common wisdom. The stock market was Las Vegas, built large. And then we began to convince ourselves that wasn't the case, that putting your money in the stock market was, according to George Bush, more secure than Social Security.
Right.
And it's not true. You're gambling, and suddenly, when a lot of money comes to the table,
the stakes go up.
And you're not investing in a bigger piece of property. You're not investing in more production, in more productive capacity, in new industries. You're investing in people investing.
Right. When the value of GM stock goes up, that doesn't mean that GM gets any more money. It means that the last guy who owned the stock got more money, or you get more money, or whatever. Larry, you've done this brilliantly with looking over the last 100 years at personal income, or back to 1913, at personal income tax rates. Warren Buffett, in his annual report for Berkshire Hathaway, 2 years ago, I believe it was, maybe 3 years ago, noted, and I'm quoting now from the Berkshire Hathaway annual report, quote, corporate taxes are at their lowest level since 1934, 7.4% of all federal tax receipts, down from 32% in 1952. In other words, currently 7% of revenue going to the federal government is from corporate taxes. In 1952, it was a third. It was 32%. Have you done the research to determine whether there's an identical correlation for corporate tax rates?
No, I haven't, and I haven't done it for capital gains, all of which I think go into the mix.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that they're all going to work out the same way.
Right. I mean, I'm not an economist. I was just listening to all of our politicians saying tax cuts, tax cuts, tax. In fact, I heard it again today. Thom Herbert's column in the New York Times started out with, you don't want to have tax cuts that are going to slow down, you don't want to have business tax hikes that are going to slow down the recovery.
Right, which is so wrong.
Which is exactly. I mean, and this is a big forum, and Thom Herbert's generally a really good liberal guy.
Yeah, Bob Herbert. Yeah.
Right. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this meme, this thought virus, which, as I said, was relatively unknown before the 1980s, as a consequence of these giant think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, and all these libertarians and Republicans, and 4 decades now of the very rich basically buying public opinion, have come to be believed to be conventional, to be true, that if you cut taxes, you stimulate the economy. And in fact, it's the opposite.
Right. Yeah. The historical record is exactly the opposite. You can date the point of recovery in all of our economic recoveries at the point where there was a tax rise.
So if you want to stimulate the economy, if you want the economy to come back, scream for higher taxes, both personal and corporate. There you go. Larry Beinhart, his new book, Salvation Boulevard, brilliant writer, a brilliant thinker. LarryBeinhart.com, his website. Larry, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks a lot.
Keep up the great work. Keep spreading the word. I will too. 16 minutes past the hour.